Welcome to the War Studies podcast. We bring you world-leading research from the School of Security Studies at King's College London, the largest community of scholars in the world dedicated to the study of all aspects of security, defence, and international relations. We explore the complex realm of conflict because the study of war is fundamental to understanding the world we live in and the world we want to live in.
Cyberwarfare is upon us. For 40 years, computer networks have afforded appropriately resourced and willing antagonists the means through which to degrade and disrupt the digital information systems of their opponents. We've become accustomed to thinking of cyberspace, the global environment enabled by interconnected computer networks, as a domain akin to the traditional military domains of land, sea, and air. Our military organizations train and deploy warfighters for cyberspace operations in peace and war, whilst intelligence agencies exploit cyberspace for a range of defensive and offensive purposes, both to collect information and also to achieve effects. Few interstate conflicts and disputes lack a cyber dimension, as Russia's hot war against Ukraine since 2014 demonstrates, as do the cooler standoffs between China and Taiwan or India and Pakistan. The essential objective of the activities grouped together as cyber warfare resolves to one simple proposition. If a target state or population has digital infrastructure or dependencies, those can be leveraged to generate effects that align with a given actor's operational and strategic objectives. Cyber capabilities are, therefore, commonly seen as part of the toolkit of contemporary statecraft as another instrument of national power. But how much of this activity in and through cyberspace qualifies as cyber warfare?
Hello, everyone. In this podcast episode, I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Tim Stevens, co-editor of the Research Handbook on Cyberwarfare, which explores the complex and often misunderstood world of cyberwarfare. Dr. Tim Stevens is Reader in International Security in the Department of War Studies. His research looks at the intersection of technology, politics, and global security practices, with a specific interest in the politics and governance of cybersecurity. Well, welcome, Tim. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And I would like to start this podcast episode with a key question, which is, what is cyberwarfare?
Yeah, this is the central question, right? It's really difficult to say precisely what cyber warfare is, but I would offer something like, and I'm warning, this is quite a long definition. Cyber warfare is a form of military intelligence statecraft that leverages computer networks and data to generate tactical, operational, and strategic advantage inside and outside cyberspace. It's a bit wordy, I'm afraid, but it's really not easy to both be inclusive and precise, but at the same time try and exclude all the things that definitively are not cyber warfare, because it's very much an overused term.
Yeah, totally. And how has this concept evolved over time?
Yeah, well, the first thing to note really is that the term hasn't always been in use. And indeed, not everyone uses it now. It's not in British military doctrine, for example, nor the US, nor indeed China. So it's quite difficult to trace the term itself. I think it's, when we're thinking about cyber warfare, it's probably more fruitful to think of what the term suggests and then contextualize that within broader military intelligence frameworks and other historical currents. There's also a set of adjacent or overlapping concepts, of course, like information warfare, net war, we used to talk about a bit, network-centric warfare, and so on. And all of these together make this whole field quite tricky to map over time, but also across geographies now. And of course, languages. Cyber warfare is very much a Western Anglophone term. And indeed, it doesn't always translate particularly well when you're thinking about different languages and cultures. But the principal shift then, or the principal change, I think, has been a shift from thinking of computers as an enabler of other forms of military action, which is how computers were thought of from the 1940s through to the 1970s, to computers and the environment that they create, which is commonly called cyberspace, as being the principal components of a different form of warfighting. So that's where the domain language begins to come in. And we've been thinking about cyberspace in that kind of way since about the 1970s and through to the current day. Now, that's in the military realm. If you think about intelligence agencies have long seen this thing that we're calling cyberspace as an operational domain for intelligence gathering, for data collection, counter-espionage. But the West didn't collectively ascribe this domain thinking to cyberspace, at least not in a collective way, until the NATO Warsaw Summit in 2016. So from roughly 50 years or so, 60 years, sorry, from thinking about computers at the end of the Second World War, or 70 years, in fact, through to 2016 Warsaw Summit as an operational domain. Now, this doesn't mean that individual countries or indeed NATO itself weren't practicing what we would call cyber warfare much earlier than that. They were. It's just indicative of that shift in conceptualization and operationalization that's happened over several decades previous to that. It's if you like, it's a formalization or an institutionalization of existing practices and doctrine into thinking of cyberspace as being an operational domain, and cyber warfare, of course, being a key part of what states and intelligence agencies and their militaries do in that environment. And cyber warfare now, of course, or whatever we call it, is now the function or the purpose of distinct operational units within military and intelligence, such as the National Cyber Force in the UK. And that, again, is quite a change, particularly in the military space. And I'm sure we'll talk about this later, where you see, distinctive units and organizations set up to prosecute what we call cyber warfare. And that is very definitely a shift.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And well, on those lines, you and Dr. Joe Divany were the editors of the recently published Research Handbook on cyber warfare. So can you tell us more about this publication?
Sure. Well, if we go back to the definitional issue, when we invited people to contribute to this volume, we didn't want to be prescriptive about cyber warfare. We provided a working definition to authors, which was something like military intelligence statecraft involving the use of or the targeting of computer networks and systems. So it was a very wide set of activities. Our only stipulation, in fact, was that the usage of cyber warfare couldn't be metaphorical. Okay, you couldn't just use this term to describe anything that states or indeed non-state actors do in or through cyberspace, because there is a tendency to really overuse terms like cyber warfare and cyber war to describe things that they have almost nothing to do with any kind of rigorous understanding of those terms, and they become meaningless. And we really sought to avoid that. So trying to be very firm and rigorous about how we were thinking about cyber warfare in the individual chapters. And our authors respected that greatly. And we invited established scholars, early career researchers, doctoral students, practitioners, think tankers. If they were an expert on a particular topic that was relevant to cyber warfare, we invited them to contribute. And it wasn't about career stage, it was about their individual expertise and skills. And we have 36 authors across 23 chapters from at least 9 countries. And in the book, we've organized it functionally, as it were. We start with a section on concepts and theories and methods as well. Not just scholarly methods, but also thinking about journalism as a method. And we have a chapter based on an interview that we did with some very experienced journalists in the field. We then move on to look at the the particular actors and institutions that are involved in cyber warfare, and then onto the operations and strategy, cyber warfare, and then finally a section on governance. So thinking about counter-proliferation, arms control, law, ethics, and so on. And, we couldn't cover all the relevant topics we wanted to do, but we think this is probably the most comprehensive and also scholarly, aimed at research books that is available in this field. So we're very happy with the results.
Yeah, no, that's great. And what was one of the most surprising findings behind the book, like from the research behind the book?
It's quite difficult with a volume like this to answer that question, because the volume is the product of other people's research. We were just the editors. But I think one thing that was both surprising and gratifying with this project was that people were so willing to engage with a concept like cyber warfare that is actually somewhat contested. It's not always the term of art when you're talking to military or intelligence communities or practitioners of various sorts. I expected personally a lot more pushback on the term. This was a term that our publisher suggested, but that we ran with to see how far we could take it. And actually, our contributors really did engage with the term. And what that tells us, or what that tells me anyway, is that cyber warfare as a term has a lot of conceptual and practical traction, even if that isn't always translated into the language that we use in policy, doctrine, and strategy. So it is a term that we use both as scholars and as practitioners to think about what is happening in this environment, even if it's not a label that higher up the food chain is necessarily being used to describe those practices and behaviors. That surprised me a little, actually. I thought we'd get a lot of chapter authors suggesting that maybe we should ditch the term entirely and work with something else. But no, they did. They engaged with it in a very productive, constructive way. And actually, as a result, has ended up with being able to think about cyber warfare in much more rigorous terms than previously, being able to narrow that focus sufficiently whilst also retaining some generalizability across different countries and contexts, and being able to stamp some kind of analytical frameworks on this very confusing term, cyber warfare.
Yeah. And well, how does cyber warfare function as a form of military intelligence statecraft? And what distinguishes it from traditional forms of intelligence and warfare?
That's a really interesting question. And cyber warfare definitely is different in some ways from more traditional forms of intelligence and warfare. In one respect, it is wholly dependent on computers and data. So it is different, say, from kinetic war. But in that respect, it also has some similarities with intelligence in particular, because the principal medium of exchange in both intelligence and cyber warfare is information. And for that reason, there is this raging debate in cybersecurity studies at the moment, or cyber conflict studies, about whether cyber conflicts are just another form of intelligence competition. So there are lots of similarities because that principal medium of exchange is information. But it is quite different from the way we think about kinetic warfare, which involves bullets, bombs, and bodies. But I would caution against anyone thinking that cyber warfare is totally different from kinetic warfare. It's tempting sometimes to look at a set of technologies, quantum, AI, cyber, and start pontificating about revolutions in military and intelligence affairs, how everything is going to be different, how everything is going to change. But at the core of it, a rather more productive approach is to consider what the purpose of all those activities is. And all statecraft, military, intelligence, diplomatic, is an exercise in communication, intended to bring about a change, usually in the environment, of course, but also in your adversary's thinking, their opinions and behaviors. And in that respect, cyber warfare is no different, which is why we increasingly discuss cyber warfare, and indeed it's framed in doctrine in terms of the effect that cyber warfare is intended to bring about. So in the UK, National Cyber Force is explicit in its public statement, which is kind of quasi-doctrinal, but it's explicit in those statements on cognitive effects, which underlines that these capabilities exist primarily as a means through which to affect the decision-making of its targets, rather than just being undertaken for the sake of it. It's not just about damaging data, it's about the cognitive effects that are caused by damage to that data and the way in which you can change adversaries' thinking and behaviors. And in that way, cyber warfare is actually quite closely aligned to traditional military and intelligence statecraft, although, of course, the tactics and the techniques are quite distinct because of the use of computers and systems and data. They have that kind of tactical, technical difference, but at the operational strategic level, the intentions and implications can be very similar.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And who are the primary actors involved in cyber warfare today, and what are their main objectives and strategies?
Yeah, the way we've framed it, and the way, in fact, our authors have engaged with it, is that states are the principal actors. It doesn't mean that corporate actors and non-state actors don't have a role to play. Of course they do, but states are the principal agents of cyber warfare as a form of statecraft. And their objectives are very similar to as they ever were, to generate strategic advantage or tactical or operational advantage relative to their competitors. And cyber offers a relatively cheap option that does not require putting one's people in immediate harm's way, because you can do it at distance through computer networks. It's also easy to deny. We didn't do it. How can you prove it? And there's something called the attribution problem in this field that complicates those issues. And it also occupies a slightly grey area in international law, although states disagree on that particular point. And for those reasons, it's seen as a good option for use in international competition short of war. And of course, you can also use it in times of crisis and conflict too. So states are the principal actors there, and dozens of states are developing an offensive cyber capability, even if only a handful of them are particularly good at it or are suitably resourced to be able to undertake it in the first place. And sometimes those capabilities are housed within existing functions, like a signals intelligence function, perhaps, or in new military intelligence units like, the UK National Cyber Force. And the major powers have invested significant resource into this area. US Cyber Command since 2010, and the reorganization of the Chinese PLA and its new information support force are two really good examples of high-level strategic reorientation of massive military and intelligence structures to prosecute what we call cyber warfare.
And can you provide more examples of how digital systems are exploited in cyber warfare to achieve operational and strategic advantages?
Yeah, I mean, this is intimately related to what we think cyber warfare is for, which varies quite a lot between countries and jurisdictions, and actually sometimes within them. You see some bureaucratic competition within states or within countries about what these capabilities are for. And in the UK, our cyber warfare units are very closely constrained, very tightly constrained, and they operate in war, in joint military operations, in combined arms operations, and so on. But in peacetime, they're principally counter-terrorism and counter-crime units, although, of course, they do undertake covert operations against hostile powers and non-state actors and so on. But in other jurisdictions, like Russia and China, for example, there are no such constraints. And those cyber warfare units are relatively free, certainly much freer than most Western units, to use their capabilities to subvert democratic process in foreign countries, to commit cybercrime, to generate revenue for those regimes, to disrupt critical infrastructures, and so on. And as long as what they're doing is annoying to the targets and when desired damaging, it's fine. Your purpose is there. You're there to exploit your adversary's dependence on digital networks and to keep them busy fixing the problems that you've caused, including, of course, investing considerable sums in cybersecurity, and to weaken them incrementally over time. That's the theory behind the strategy anyway. And when that shifts even more into the kind of informational space of misinformation, disinformation, computational propaganda, and so on, which is not what we look at in this volume, but it's also about sowing discord, eroding trust in institutions, damaging governance, and so on, all of which is meant to weaken your adversary in particular ways.
You have been talking about the impact and implications of cyber warfare worldwide, but how does cyber warfare impact everyday life?
Yeah, this is part of the reason why cyber warfare can be quite difficult to communicate. Now, it also depends a little bit on what you think qualifies as cyber warfare. If you ask Ukrainians about how cyber warfare has affected their lives, and they will tell you about cyber attacks on the power grid last decade. Whether that qualifies as their principal concern, I suspect it does not. But you can see that knocking out electricity in the winter because you've subverted the functioning of a power station, you can see how knocking out the power grid can really impact daily life. It's cold, you have no heat. I mean, that's going to affect you in many ways. But if you expand the aperture a little bit and think about the cyber warfare posture of a country like North Korea, that uses cyber as a means of generating revenue and avoiding sanctions, you get a slightly different picture, because those operations are felt worldwide. The ones in Ukraine are relatively targeted. But if North Korea is conducting cybercrime operations that it basically releases onto the global internet and sees where it hits, then you've got a different picture, because that's what happened in 2017 in the UK and across Europe and many other places besides, on a nasty little piece of ransomware, or it was meant to look like ransomware anyway, that we call WannaCry. It locked up National Health Service systems and dozens of other organizations for some time before a fix was arrived at. So if that's cyber warfare, then there's a rather indiscriminate impact globally on systems that are vulnerable to particular types of malicious software. And there are lots and lots of other examples of that. And a slightly different example is if a state protects cybercrime groups in its territory, and those cybercrime groups go on to disrupt energy systems or health or banking infrastructure in another country, as is happening every single day, does that qualify as cyber warfare by proxy? It would do in other domains, in kinetic domains. So there's a plausible case, for example, that the cyber incident in the UK by a Russian ransomware crime group, which the NHS is still recovering from, could be considered cyber warfare by proxy. It aligns with Russian interest, which is to make a nuisance of itself in UK networks, to degrade trust in a public institution. And it also happened because that crime group is being harbored in Russia. And as long as it doesn't attack Russian targets, it's allowed to operate. So those types of everyday impacts are being felt around the world in any suitably developed country that has digital infrastructure that can be subverted and damaged in that fashion. Was that cyber warfare? Probably not. I would suggest a subset of it is, and that has real world everyday effects beyond just the kind of sort of data protection aspects. There are data breaches all the time, but when you're actually knocking out pieces of critical infrastructure, especially across health and energy, but also finance, transport, civil nuclear, that's the real fear for a lot of people. But those critical infrastructures are being targeted by cyber actors, then you are beginning to impact everyday life in very measurable ways.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And in those lines, the handbook also mentions that cyber warfare can be regulated to mitigate its adverse effects on society. So what are some of these adverse effects? You already mentioned some of them. And how can they be mitigated?
Yeah, so the point here, of course, is that anything can be regulated. It's whether there's the political will to do so. Now, example, all United Nations member states have signed up to 11 norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Okay, this was something that spent 20 years thrashing out in working groups in the UN General Assembly, and we're there. Everyone signed up to them. They look good. So there's lots of different principles in there that you shouldn't attack another state's critical infrastructure, for example. You shouldn't undermine their computer emergency response teams. You shouldn't prevent misuse of information communications technologies in your territory, such as, for example, to prosecute cybercrime. Yet states do or allow all of those things and much, much more. And some countries actively seek to respect and implement those norms. Obviously, norms don't do anything on their own. They only are effective in practice, so you have to implement them and maintain them over time. And some countries actively look to do that. And for others, it's just lip service. It's just a diplomatic, we've signed up to this, but there's the say-do gap, as we often talk about. There's a gap between what you say and what you do in practice. So there is they can be regulated. I mean, norms are not regulation, I get that, but they could lead to regulation. But if you're abiding by the norms, then you don't need regulation. But the additional problem in this space is that if your adversaries are operating in that space, then you have to also. Because if you don't, then there's no deterrence, and you're effectively allowing no deterrence through cyber anyway. And you're effectively allowing your adversaries a free hand to do all sorts of unpleasant things in your networks, to subvert critical infrastructure and ultimately to create adverse effects against your population. So there is this uncomfortable security dilemma, we call it in international relations, which is if somebody is operating in that space and tooling up to commit malfeasance in a particular environment, then everyone else kind of follows suit because you have to. So over time, there has been there is an escalatory effect. But at the same time, you are trying to dampen that escalation by creating these international norms and getting people to abide by them and to operationalize them. So there's lots of complex dynamics in this space, which means that at the end of the day, it's quite difficult to regulate in that space, or at least to provide rules or frameworks reducing these types of operations when everybody sees it as essential to have those types of capabilities.
Yes, And what ethical considerations arise at the intersection of cyber warfare and international relations?
Yeah, of course, the principal issue area that comes up in most of these conversations regards international humanitarian law, so IHL, the laws of armed conflict. And these questions about how can or how should cyber capabilities be used in war in ways that respect the principles of military necessity and proportionality, and of course, the rights of non-combatants. And there is a fairly respectable argument that cyber means might be preferable in war to kinetic capabilities because they don't lead directly to kinetic harm, not as we ordinarily understand it. Of course, the flip side of that is that if they're preferable to be used, they might be used too easily and too often, which over time would create, higher levels of harm to non-combatants than if you just used, precision strikes on kinetic targets. So the argument has its problems, but thinking about how cyber capabilities abide by those principles of military necessity and proportionality is one of the key ethical issues. So one of the main areas of ethical consideration is the use of these capabilities in scenarios or situations that are very obviously war or war-like. But what happens when you're not thinking about war and you're thinking about non-war situations, like a persistent condition of strategic competition? Is it ethical to subject peaceful populations, who are by definition non-combatant, to potential or actual harm through cyber means, such as from knocking out a hospital or water distribution for a day or more? It's almost certainly not legal, but how can it be considered ethical? And how do you address this? And how you address that issue really comes down to national approaches to foreign policy. Pure realpolitik would put the national interest before ethics or morality every time. So civilian harm, potential or actual, is secondary to the strategic gain or the operational advantage that might accrue if you're conducting those operations in times of peace. So there's an issue there about, is it right that countries are using what we might call cyber warfare against civilian populations who are not at war with each other? But that is the major way in which these capabilities are being used, right? But it's other countries would say, all right, so we're not conducting pure realpolitik. We have an ethical foreign policy which helps to guide our use of cyber capabilities. An ethical foreign policy that's based on respect for human rights and so on. But that's also very difficult to operationalize under pressure, particularly if your own country is getting hammered by an adversary who's conducting literally hundreds of, or if not thousands of cyber operations against you every year. You can't say we're going to do nothing in response, but is what I'm doing going to be shaped by international law and ethics such that we can, legitimately say we have an ethical foreign policy that's guiding and shaping our use of cyber warfare? That's the approach the UK is trying to take, and it's really, really difficult to do. And I don't think we should kind of diminish the sorts of conversations that will be conducted behind closed doors, usually with a lawyer in the room, about whether things are legal or not, and indeed whether they're ethical. But I'd love to be a fly on the wall. And of course, we should always ask when we're having these conversations about interest and ethics, is whose ethics and whose interests. And ethics are not necessarily universal, and interests are never universal. So it's difficult to think about binding ethical frameworks that would satisfy all parties to this particular contemporary problem.
Yes. And in what ways do non-state actors leverage cyber warfare to advance their international agendas?
Yeah, this is almost a work in progress, this particular aspect of cyber warfare. Now, when we put the volume together, we deliberately wanted to constrain our authors to thinking about cyber warfare as a form of statecraft. As I've said, we didn't want to over-determine that or over-define it, but it was something that was principally conducted by states. But it's really obvious that not only states are involved in cyber warfare. Many firms, for example, they sell products and services into the political economy of cyber warfare. Academics advise militaries and intelligence services. And journalists can both challenge and serve state interest in this space. There's lots of different types of actors, and there are other elements of civil society as well. And other non-state actors are also relevant. I mentioned cybercrime groups. who often operate as state cyber warfare proxies. Russia's the prime example of that, but there are others. But there are also non-state armed groups like Hamas and Hezbollah that have capabilities that resemble in type, if not in scope, state cyber warfare actions. Now, they differ considerably in their scale, their expertise, their resourcing, and so on. But those actors are generally even less bound by international law and norms than state actors. In fact, they pretty much invent the rules to align with their interests. So it's perhaps fortunate that groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, and there are lots of others, that they're not yet too adept at cyber warfare. But that's not for lack of thinking about it or trying. There's a lot of different constraints on non-state armed groups thinking about cyber warfare capabilities. But if they had the capability, you can be sure that they'd use them. Now, the Israelis may have a different view of that because of the geographical proximity and because of the particular political context of the Middle East. But I can safely say that we're not yet at the point where that long discussed and hitherto invisible thing called cyber terrorism is a major issue. It hasn't yet converged with cyber warfare because there just aren't the kind of capabilities and expertise out there to prosecute it. But I mean, you watch this space effectively. And as it becomes not always easy, but certainly straightforward to purchase capabilities and platforms for using them, you may see more non-state groups, armed or otherwise, moving into that space and attempting to generate advantage through those means. And of course, the whole cybercrime economy doesn't really care who it sells to for the most part. And a lot of the capabilities are really cheap. You can rent them, you can buy them, and you can use them in whatever way you see fit. And I think we're going to see a lot more action in that particular environment over the next few years. And of course, cybercrime groups are themselves non-state actors. We shouldn't forget how important they are to the whole economy of cyber conflict, if not cyber warfare.
And how do emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing impact the future of cyber warfare and international security?
Yeah, that's a massive question with not enough time to answer it. But I mean, I guess I'd offer a couple of thoughts on that. When we're thinking about quantum computing, one of the fears here is around quantum encryption or decryption more specifically. The internet runs on encryption. It's what allows us to conduct secure communications. Our banking relies on it, trade relies on it. And in fact, every single act of communication we undertake on the internet effectively is encrypted in some way or another. Quantum threatens to break all of that. And that would be a huge problem, not just for national and international security, but for the security of all communications, because there would be none. That's the theory anyway. Which is why you see, for example, the Department of Defense in the US, it's running what it calls post-quantum cryptographic competitions and so on, and has projects in that space that are trying to quantum proof, if you like, conventional cryptography now, so that it can be robust against quantum cryptographic attacks later, cryptologic attacks later. Whether that's going to be successful or not, we don't know, but they're at quite an advanced stage, actually. But if quantum breaks encryption, the lack of encryption could break the internet. That's the principle at stake here. And of course, that would have implications for cyber warfare. And it would, I guess, provide all sorts of new opportunities for bad actors to do unpleasant things through the networks. But they themselves would likely be seriously compromised by their inability to encrypt their own communications, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a quantum. That sort of post-quantum cryptographic problem is a pretty unpleasant one, and it concerns people greatly. Second, emerging tech, these technologies are always emerging, aren't they? But quite a lot of the time, they're actually there already. And that would be the case for AI. AI is already widely used in cybersecurity. And we've been talking about machine learning in this field for years and years and years, particularly as more and more of the really data-heavy computation and processing has been automated. And AI is really good at some of those automated tasks, and in fact, far, far, far better, of course, than humans, for whom it would take millennia to do some of the most simple tasks. Now, there's a big discussion about whether AI, and I mean, I don't particularly like the singular term AI. I think it's a set of technologies of various types and rationalities, but There's this big discussion about whether AI is better for cyber offense or cyber defense. So there's major claims made, for example, for the automation of offensive measures, for development of malware or target identification. The fact is, and this is an interesting argument that's picking up a little bit of speed, when you think about cyber warfare, the only way it's going to work is if there's a vulnerability in a target that you can exploit, right? And you use code that is built, and I suppose that could be automated, but the code is built to exploit that vulnerability. If you, as a defender, recognize that you have a vulnerability, you can patch it. Okay? If you don't patch it, it's left open and an adversary can exploit it. Now, imagine you had defensive cybersecurity AI that automates vulnerability detection and mitigation, patches those things quickly and effectively. Well, hypothetically, it should be able to fix the problems much faster than an adversary can develop an exploit to exploit that vulnerability. So there is an argument that defensive AI might actually be quicker than offensive AI in this space, which means ultimately that the level of security will go up. Now, if the opposite were true, of course, and offensive AI is much faster than defensive AI in cybersecurity, then the overall level of security is going to go down. So we don't yet know really what's going to happen in that space. And of course, what happens in reality is always much more complicated than a simple model like that suggests. But AI might be good for cyber warfare or for cybersecurity and stability as we look ahead. So it might reduce the opportunities available for cyber warfare.
Well, yeah, we'll see for sure. And why do you think it's crucial for society to understand and address the implications of cyber warfare?
Yeah, well, this is the nub of it all, isn't it? That why should anyone care? Surely this is just states doing relatively obscure things through rather abstract notions like vulnerability and malware and so on. But the principal reason why people should care about this and why it all matters is that we are all dependent on computer networks. Pretty much everything that we do. It's as simple as that. And dependence on anything is a vulnerability in itself that can be exploited. And the push towards hyperconnectivity through digital systems is a huge vulnerability that is already being exploited every day. And the problem we have here is that, as far as I'm aware, it's mathematically impossible to have a 100% secure information system. Information systems always have flaws in logic, in the code that's used to build them, but also in you and I, users. We do things that aren't meant to be done to these systems. We make mistakes, we configure them wrongly, click on that link, we open that email attachment. Now, we've been told not to, but we still do it. There's social vulnerabilities as well, and technical vulnerabilities in pretty much any of these information systems. And that's why these systems are available for exploitation. So vulnerabilities will be exploited. And at the moment, we can't build anything that doesn't have vulnerabilities, but yet we're depending on them more and more and more and more and more. So what's the end point of that dynamic? Well, there are no purely technical fixes to cyber insecurity, and there don't seem to be any political fixes on the horizon either. And yet this problem is getting worse. And we're in for a very long and difficult couple of decades. And whatever we call it, cyber warfare is going to be a major feature of that. We need to learn to get to grips with it now, rather than punting it into some science fictional future.
Yes. Well, and considering these vulnerabilities, how do you envision the future of cyber warfare evolving, especially considering what is happening worldwide in terms of geopolitics and international affairs and so on?
Yeah, well, mine is not a counsel of despair. It's not saying we're all going to hell in a handcart. That's not true. You have to ask the kind of counterfactual question here, which if it were not for the millions of individuals every day whose job it is to maintain, fix, build, develop, and run these systems, then how much worse would it have been? And frankly, the answer is, the internet would not look like it does today. There's problems with the internet, but most of us use it most of the time without too many problems. And I think that is testament to all the hard work that goes into it. And yet, my concern is this one about dependence. And we are seeing things not only added to the internet, but also interconnected through the internet at a rate of knots that is frankly astonishing. And, awful lot of good things have come out of it and will continue to do so. but it also creates problems because you're creating highly complex systems that you don't know the full sort of topography of, or even the logical topologies of them. You don't know what is on there at any given moment. You don't know what everyone is doing. You don't understand it. And it's really difficult when you don't understand the system to be able to comprehend what may happen to it or what's going to happen next. And when everything's so tightly coupled and tightly connected, if something goes wrong in one place, it may well ripple through those networks and go wrong in another place. And the one way to solve that is to separate critical parts of the network. But instead, what we're doing is we're connecting them up. And I think that's potentially, unless we really crack this cybersecurity issue, it's really storing up some problems for the future. And we've seen a couple of recent incidents that have really highlighted the vulnerability that comes from dependence and hyperconnectivity. The other thing I would say about this is that when we're thinking about cyber warfare, for years and years and years, a lot of attention was focused on what happens if China pushes the big red button and the lights go out forever. And the empirical record does not suggest anything like that is likely to happen anytime soon, because that's the flip side of the interconnectivity. If you decide you're going to disrupt the London Stock Exchange to an enormous degree because it's really going to annoy the Brits, well, it's not just going to annoy the Brits. It's going to bring down Wall Street. It's going to affect the stock exchanges in Beijing. It's going to knock out and have these sort of awful rippling effects through the global financial system. We've seen that happen through non-cyber means in the past, roughly every 10 years, in fact. And it doesn't do anyone any good whatsoever. It affects everyone. And I think, when we're thinking about energy and power and logistics and transport, and we've seen international logistics networks be deeply affected before COVID, and COVID just showed again how fragile these systems are. But my point is, we haven't seen any of those really large-scale catastrophic attacks because, largely speaking, we're all not at war with one another. We're in a state of competition for sure, but within competition. If you want to play the game, field has to stay roughly the same. If you start destroying infrastructure left and right through some unspecified cyber means, then it's going to affect you as well. It's called blowback. So we haven't seen that yet. I think the problem really comes is that if an actor is desperate enough to push that that metaphorical red button during a time of elevated crisis or indeed of war, then we may see the true potential of what some countries have stored up in terms of what they can do through the means of cyber warfare. But I think we're a long way from that. So that's a good thing. But again, don't want to go too far into the realms of speculation here. What we're currently seeing is rampant vulnerabilities and exploitation of dependence in relatively localized fashion, but it might get worse. I don't think this problem is going away, though, and all it really takes is for a bit of miscalculation and for something serious to happen in the networks, and that will be the spur to a whole round of other conversations about what can be done and what must be done. But we've been having those conversations now for at least 20 years, and we're still having them, and the problems are still the same, and so on and so forth. So I don't know what the future holds, but it'll be interesting to see.
For sure. And to finish this podcast episode, to conclude it, what are the key messages you hope readers will take away from the handbook?
Yeah, well, first, I hope that people will read it, or selected chapters at least that are relevant to their interests. I hope it pops up on a few reading lists here and there. And our students, of course, can already access it via the library. The principal message is I've hinted at this a couple of times, which is really to engage with cyber warfare on a non-metaphorical, non-abstract, non-science fiction level, right? This stuff is real, it has real world impact, and it needs to be addressed as a fact of international life rather than through speculation and conjecture. And the authors in this volume demonstrate this admirably. It's a very empirically rich volume, and we hope that other scholars and practitioners and our students, crucially, will turn their attention to this much misunderstood topic. I mean, the central message, I suppose, is this is real. Check it out, see what you can bring to the conversation, and there are lots of skills and expertise that be really useful in this space. One of the things I guess that the handbook shows in a way, and I certainly feel very strongly about this, is that this is an interdisciplinary problem. It's not a problem just for computer scientists or for political scientists. It's one that engages the whole of society, and as such deserves a whole of society response. And from an academic perspective, Certainly there are things we can learn as IR scholars from geography, from sociology, from history, of course, and also, of course, from our computer science colleagues across the sciences. But it is an interdisciplinary problem, addressed at least in an interdisciplinary fashion. And I invite the audience to do precisely that.
Well, Tim, thank you very much for sharing your invaluable insights and expertise with us today. And of course, thank you very much to our listeners for being part of this important discussion.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the War Studies podcast, produced and edited by the School of Security Studies Communications team. For more information on our work, visit our website, which you'll find in the podcast description. If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you could rate and review us on your preferred podcast provider. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the War Studies podcast.